The winter of 1939 settled over Prague like a held breath, a quiet so dense it pressed against the windows of the children's shelter on Benediktinska Street. Snow had gathered along the eaves, softening the edges of the old building, though inside nothing felt softened at all. The silence had become a rule, a sentence, a way for the world outside to reach in and govern even the smallest voices within. The children learned early. Sound, especially laughter, drew attention. Attention drew questions, and questions in those months could take a child away. I remember the mornings most, when the grey light filtered through the frosted panes and the children sat on the long wooden benches, hands folded, eyes turned down as if even their gaze might break the stillness. The youngest of them, little Mila, used to hum under her breath while dressing her doll. But one day her humming stopped, and the doll's porcelain face seemed to stare into a silence it could not understand. You could hear the war by its absences, the missing footsteps of neighbors, the empty seat at a table, the sudden quiet that fell whenever a uniform passed near the doorway. In the shelter, we tried to keep the rhythms gentle: warm soup, woolen blankets, stories whispered when the lamps were low. But the air itself felt watchful. Even the walls had begun to listen. And through all this, I wondered, how do you protect a child from a world that insists on quieting them, not only in their voices, but in the very shape of their small, shining existence? My name is Eliška Havel, and in those first years of the occupation, I served as one of 2 caretakers at the shelter. I had no children of my own, though I often joked that the shelter had given me 20 at once. Some were orphaned, some sent by desperate parents who promised to return soon, and some brought to us by strangers who never spoke their names. The shelter stood in the old town, tucked between a shuttered bakery and a stone courtyard where pigeons gathered, unbothered by the turmoil of human borders. The rooms smelled of starch and candle smoke, and every cupboard held mismatched bowls and tiny gloves that always seemed to lose their pairs. The child I write about now, little Mila Novotna, age 7, arrived in November wearing a coat too big for her and a satchel filled only with a folded drawing of her mother. Her silence wasn't the enforced kind. It was gentler, like she was listening for footsteps that never came. I didn't know then how deeply her quiet would shape the months that followed. From the very first morning, Mila sat near the radiator in the main hall, as though she were trying to warm not only her hands, but some deeper part of herself. The other children played carefully. Small wooden blocks, paper cutouts, the ragged ball stuffed with rags. But they watched the door constantly, always attuned to the sound of boots on stone. At the shelter, we taught them to move lightly, to speak only when necessary, to keep their belongings folded and close. The rules had grown not from cruelty but fear. Fear of inspections, of questions, of becoming the next place from which children simply vanished. Mila adapted quickly. She was not a child who rebelled. Instead, she seemed to drift through the shelter rooms like a pale moth. When she smiled, it was brief and flickered like a candle in a draught. She carried her satchel everywhere, even to meals, and whenever she thought no one was watching, she would take out the folded paper, her mother's drawing, and smooth it gently with her palm. But what stays with me most is the morning she broke her own silence. It was early, the sky still tucked in the dark. I had risen to light the stove, hoping to warm the room before the children woke. When I stepped into the hall, I found her sitting upright on her mattress, the satchel open beside her, the drawing in her lap. "Will she find me?" she whispered. Her voice was so small I almost believed the silence would swallow it whole. I knelt beside her, careful not to disturb the other sleeping children. Her question, so simple yet so unbearably large, hung between us. "Yes," I said softly, though I had no way to know. "She will look for you as far as she can." That seemed to comfort her. She folded the drawing again, hiding its creases as though smoothing them could undo the distance now carved between her and her mother. And then she did something so innocent it felt like a wound. She placed the drawing over her chest like a shield and lay back down. From that morning forward, I began to watch her more closely. Something in her quiet carried a weight too heavy for her small frame. Yet she never complained, never asked for more bread, never pushed another child aside. Sometimes I wondered whether the silence outside the shelter had seeped into her bones, shaping her into a child half made of quiet. Or perhaps she was simply holding herself still, hoping the world might unbreak long enough for someone to come claim her. But the weeks passed, winter deepened, and every day the silence around her grew a little colder. The children had their own ways of surviving the hush that surrounded us. Some traced shapes on the fogged windows, others whispered stories under blankets. But Mila, she used sound as though it was something she had once known, but wasn't certain she still deserved. I began to find her in the courtyard during the brief mid-afternoon recess, even when the cold stung our cheeks. She would sit on the stone bench, watching the pigeons gather around crumbs left behind by the baker's vanished customers. One day, as I brushed snow off her shoulders, she asked, "Do pigeons know where home is?" "Yes," I told her. "They always find their way." She nodded, not looking at me. "Even when everything changes." Her small hands were cupped around a crust of bread she had saved from breakfast. She tossed it gently toward the birds, who fought over it with soft flurries of wings. Watching them, her face changed, some timid hope flickering there, and for the first time, I felt the smallest edge of her silence loosen. Inside the shelter, life continued in its restrained rhythm. We mended mittens, boiled potatoes, taught the children to read quietly, turning pages with the gentlest rustle. They learned to listen more than they spoke. Yet, children remember differently than adults. Their memories gather around the tiny things: the button they lost, the warmth of a hand, the way a shadow moved across a wall. And even in that oppressive quiet, their small, unguarded moments still surfaced. One evening, as I passed the dormitory, I heard soft, muffled giggles. That sound was dangerous, fragile, like glass on stone. I paused and peeked in. Mila was showing the other girls her folded drawing, pointing at the sketched lines that formed her mother's face. Eyes shaped like almonds, a braid that curved over one shoulder. "She used to sing when she brushed my hair," she whispered. The girls leaned in as though she were offering a secret sweet. "What did she sing?" one asked. Mila hesitated, then hummed a note, just one. A single trembling thread of sound. The others waited, breaths held, but Mila shook her head and tucked the drawing away. "That's all I remember," she said softly. Later that night, after the girls had fallen asleep, I found myself humming the same note while cleaning the lanterns. It hung in the air like a ghost, brief, incomplete, yet filled with something unmistakably alive. In a place where silence had been imposed like a law, that single note felt like rebellion. Small, yes, but radiant. And that, I would soon learn, is what little voices remember most. Not the shadows of fear, but the fragments of love that managed to survive them. Winter tightened its grip, and with it came more inspections. Officers arrived unannounced, boots echoing through the hallways, asking questions with eyes sharper than their words. The children always stiffened when they heard those footsteps. Mila would always reach for her satchel. During one such inspection, an officer lifted a child's blanket with the tip of his boot, as though even fabric might hold danger. He walked through the rows of beds, pausing now and then to assess faces far too young to bear the scrutiny. When he stopped by Mila, she didn't flinch. She only held her satchel closer. "What's in there?" he asked. "Just paper," she answered. Her calmness startled me, but the officer only glanced at me, then moved on. It wasn't courage that lived in her voice, I realized. It was resignation, the kind children should never know. A week later, the absence arrived. It came not as a sound, not as a knock, but as a missing coat on its peg. Mila's coat. By the time we realized she was gone, there was no trace. No hurried footprints in the snow, no officer's question, no witness from the courtyard. Children disappeared in those days the way stars fade at dawn, quietly, without ceremony. Her satchel remained on her bed, the buckle undone. Inside it, I found the drawing, still folded, still smoothed by her small hands. I sat there for a long time, holding that fragile paper. It felt unright that it was left behind, as though she had never planned to go, as though she had meant to return for it, and in the days that followed, the shelter's silence changed. It was no longer the hush we obeyed. It was a hollow, a space shaped exactly like a small girl, with a single remembered note of a song. After Mila's disappearance, the children moved more softly, as if their footsteps could disturb what was missing. Even the pigeons seemed quieter in the courtyard, gathering without their usual clatter of wings. I found myself lingering by her empty bed each morning. Sometimes I imagined that she had simply stepped outside and would soon run back in, cheeks rosy, satchel bouncing at her side. But the bed stayed neatly made. The satchel remained untouched, and the drawing, her mother's face, felt heavier each time I unfolded it. I began keeping it in my apron pocket, unable to leave it behind. It felt like the only part of her still anchored to the world. The children, sensing more than I ever said, started leaving small offerings on her pillow, half a biscuit, a ribbon, a tiny carved horse, things children give when they don't know how to grieve. One evening, as the lamps flickered low, I told them the truth as gently as I could. "We don't know where Mila is now," I said, "but we will remember her." "And her mother?" one child asked. I held the drawing up so its lines caught the warm lamplight. "We remember her too." That night, instead of the mandated silence, a soft humming drifted through the room. It started with one child, then another. A simple, wavering note, Mila's note. The shelter filled with the smallest resistance imaginable, children reclaiming sound. They hummed, not loudly, not defiantly, but with tenderness, a remembrance, a refusal to let a small voice be erased. And for the first time in months, the silence around us didn't feel imposed. It felt chosen, a quiet built from memory, not fear. Now, decades later, I still keep Mila's drawing pressed between the pages of a small journal. The creases have deepened, the paper yellowed, but her mother's face remains, gentle, watchful, unfinished in the way all memories are. Sometimes I wonder if Mila ever found her way home, or if home became something she carried in her chest, like that folded paper. I will never know, but I remember her in every still moment, every soft note hummed in winter's air. And I hold this truth close. Even in a world that demanded silence, a child's quiet heart still found ways to speak. If this story touched you, dear reader, I invite you gently, gratefully to like and subscribe so that more forgotten voices may find their way back into the light.